On the morning of October 19, 2016, Robert Keller left his home in Naperville, Illinois, just after 6:30 a.m. It was raining lightly. He kissed his wife, Ellen, on the cheek, told his two kids, Jack, 12, and Leah, 8, to behave for their mom, and wheeled a black Samsonite suitcase into the garage. He'd done this kind of trip dozens of times before. Same company, same destination, same tech expo in San Francisco. His flight was scheduled to leave O'Hare at 9:20 a.m. Traffic was normal for a weekday. He arrived at the airport a little before 8:00, parked in long-term Lot G. The last confirmed sighting of Robert Keller was captured at 8:13 a.m., walking alone through the terminal's lower concourse. He wore jeans, a navy windbreaker, and carried a small backpack. The Samsonite never appeared on baggage check logs. He wasn't flagged by TSA. And at 9:20 a.m., United Airlines Flight 432 departed Gate B-17 with one no-show, Robert Keller. His family didn't panic at first. He had a habit of switching his phone off during flights. Ellen assumed he'd landed and gone straight into back-to-back meetings. When he hadn't responded by evening, she texted again. No reply. By the next morning, she'd called his hotel in San Francisco. They told her he'd never checked in. By that afternoon, she was calling police. A missing persons report was filed within 48 hours. Chicago PD, then airport security, then federal authorities because of the airport jurisdiction. Investigators moved fast. They pulled hours of security footage, compared timestamps, searched facial recognition databases. What they found only deepened the mystery. The footage clearly showed Robert entering the terminal. He passed through the revolving doors, used a kiosk to check something on his phone, possibly his boarding pass, then walked toward the concourse that led to TSA security. But he never appeared on the footage from the security line. Somewhere between entering the concourse and where TSA scans begin, he simply vanished. There was no sign of him turning around, no evidence of a medical emergency. He didn't reappear at the check-in desk or in the food court. Airport security scoured secondary footage from adjacent areas, stairwells, employee corridors, even the bathrooms. Nothing. One camera, positioned above a vending area near the far end of the concourse, caught a blurry figure that might have been Robert walking toward a restricted utility hallway. But the timestamp was corrupted, and resolution was too poor for confirmation. His car was still parked in the lot, locked, untouched, no signs of struggle or foul play. His hotel never received a reservation check-in. His corporate card showed no activity past the evening before. Phone records indicated a final ping from the airport's cell tower at 8:21 a.m., and then silence. No outgoing calls, no data usage. It was like a light switch being flipped off. For the first week, the theory was simple. Stress. Midlife burnout. Maybe Robert had snapped, walked away from everything, disappeared by choice. But those closest to him pushed back. He wasn't a man who ran. His marriage was stable. He coached his son's soccer team, took his daughter to piano recitals, paid bills on time, left his passport in his nightstand. Every part of his life was rooted in consistency. If he'd intended to leave, he'd left no breadcrumbs behind. The FBI joined the case when it crossed the 10-day mark. Interagency searches began. Robert's name was flagged in airports nationwide. His image posted in bulletins, databases, internal watch lists. Credit reports monitored in real time. Not a single hit. Ellen refused to believe he was gone by choice. She clung to theories: wrongful abduction, medical episode, amnesia. Something had happened inside that airport, something no one had seen. She hired a private investigator, contacted the TSA herself, spoke to flight attendants, custodians, store clerks. Some remembered his face, some didn't. None could say what happened to him. By the end of the second week, the media picked up the story. Father of 2 disappears inside O'Hare. Man vanishes on way to business trip. The story gained traction briefly, then disappeared like Robert had. Police kept the case open but moved it to cold status within 3 months. There were no new leads, no new footage, no activity on any of his accounts. Forensic searches turned up nothing in the digital trail. The family held a candlelight vigil 6 months after his disappearance. Friends gathered, photos were shared. Jack and Leah each lit a candle, their hands shaking in the wind. Robert's chair at the dinner table stayed empty, his side of the bed untouched. For 7 years there was no update, no trace, no confirmed sighting, just a persistent silence that stretched until the family stopped waiting for a knock at the door, until the suitcase surfaced, and everything changed. In the weeks following Robert Keller's disappearance, O'Hare International became the epicenter of the investigation. Law enforcement, airport security, and FBI agents combed through hundreds of hours of footage from every camera between the terminal entrance and Gate B-17. Time-coded maps were built to track movement, who entered, who exited, and where their paths overlapped. Most passenger trajectories were straightforward. Robert's wasn't. At 8:13 a.m., he was seen passing through the central atrium. At 8:16, he paused at a digital kiosk by a Hudson newsstand, glancing down at his phone. That same moment, his cell pinged off a local network tower, verifying his location near Gate C. But after that, things became murky. A time-stamped clip from 8:21 showed a blurry silhouette moving down the corridor toward the Horizon Lounge, a private seating area near an old unused maintenance stairwell. Investigators couldn't say with certainty it was Robert. The figure was roughly the same height and build, wore similar clothes, but the camera angle captured only partial profile, backlit by morning glare. Then came the last trace of digital life. At 8:23 a.m., Robert's phone pinged once more, just long enough to register near the lounge's Wi-Fi network, before going completely dark. No outgoing texts, no app activity, no GPS signals. Not powered down, not switched to airplane mode, just dead. That's when police started asking harder questions. Was this voluntary? Had Robert planned to disappear, walked into that airport with the intent to never board his flight, never see his family again? If so, he'd left behind no instructions, no suicide note, no explanation. His financials showed no recent withdrawals, no overseas wire transfers, no erratic behavior. A deeper dive into his accounts revealed nothing unusual. No foreign purchases, no flagged activity. His passport hadn't been used. There was no rental car, no hotel check-in under his name. Foul play was a possibility, but there were problems with that theory too. No footage of a confrontation, no signs of physical distress, no security alarms, nothing that triggered an immediate response from personnel on the ground. A person being abducted in one of the most heavily surveilled buildings in the country without a trace seemed unlikely. But the alternative was even harder to accept. Investigators noticed something else. In several frames of early footage, between the kiosk and lounge hallway, a second individual appears behind Robert. Same corridor, same pace, always several feet back. A male figure in a dark hoodie, face partially obscured by the camera angle and crowd. In one frame, he seems to glance sideways, possibly toward Robert. In another, he disappears completely as Robert rounds the corner. Investigators attempted to enhance the images, isolate facial features, use gait analysis. Nothing conclusive. No matching ID was found among the listed passengers that day. The man never boarded any flights. He wasn't seen on exit footage. And his trail, like Robert's, evaporated near the lounge hallway. Detectives floated 3 possibilities: suicide, voluntary disappearance, or criminal act. Suicide raised immediate logistical challenges. No remains had been found, no access to dangerous areas, no bridge or ledge within the public parts of the airport. There was simply no way for a man to end his life inside O'Hare without someone noticing, unless he'd made it out without detection. Voluntary disappearance was hard to reconcile with the data. No financial preparation, no second identity, no digital breadcrumbs. He hadn't emptied any accounts or left a forwarding trace. If he had planned it, he'd done so without a single logistical misstep, which didn't align with who Robert was: responsible, methodical, structured, predictable. His wife, Ellen, sat down for multiple interviews with investigators. She was calm, but firm. She didn't believe in any of the theories. Not suicide, not running, not an affair, not a midlife break. "He would have told me," she repeated more than once. "Even if it was something terrible, he wouldn't have just left." Friends echoed the sentiment. Robert wasn't the type to implode without warning. He didn't drink, didn't gamble. He came home every night, read to his daughter, answered emails meticulously. He wasn't the kind of man who walked away. That belief is what made the uncertainty worse. The family couldn't grieve, couldn't heal, because no one could prove anything had happened. There was no body, no witnesses, no answers, just a long hallway with a blind spot and a phone that went dead. Forensics scoured Robert's laptop, recovered from home. The most recent browser history showed routine activity, weather checks, boarding pass download, a quick look at the San Francisco hotel layout. Nothing that hinted at distress or escape. The last email he sent was to a colleague confirming a 3 p.m. client meeting that same afternoon. The message ended with a smiley face. One detective, off record, called it a magician's act. A man walks into a crowded building and disappears mid-step. No struggle, no weapon, no signs. He likened it to a missing puzzle piece, not lost, but never made. Years would pass, and the same questions would be asked with the same tired answers. Robert Keller walked into O'Hare Airport, and no one could say what happened after, not with certainty, not with proof. Just a shadowed figure, a hallway, a ping, and then silence. But 7 years later, that silence would break. Not from a witness, not from new footage, but from something far more personal, something that carried Robert's name, his scent, and his story. A suitcase, left where no one was supposed to find it. By the third week of Robert Keller's disappearance, the tone of the investigation began to shift. What had started as a baffling vanishing act inside a controlled, high-surveillance airport was now beginning to resemble something more personal, more human. Detectives started asking deeper questions, not about the airport or the terminal or the phone ping, but about Robert himself, who he was, what he might have been hiding, and whether the man who'd kissed his kids goodbye that morning had already decided not to come back. It began with a discrepancy in his financial records. On paper, Robert's income was solid. A lead developer at a mid-sized software firm, he earned just over $130,000 annually, and Ellen's part-time remote marketing job added another $30,000. They owned their house, had 2 vehicles, and no visible history of financial trouble. But when bank subpoenas were executed, red flags appeared. In the months leading up to his disappearance, Robert had withdrawn nearly $18,000 in cash, spread across multiple ATMs and accounts. Some transactions were in increments small enough to avoid automatic bank alerts. Others were maxed withdrawals from secondary credit unions Ellen didn't know existed. More troubling was the discovery of a credit card in his name that Ellen had never seen, opened less than a year prior, registered to a P.O. box in Joliet. It carried a balance of nearly $9,000. Charges included multiple rideshares in remote areas, hotel bookings in smaller towns, and 3 purchases from an online identity masking service. When confronted with this, Ellen sat in stunned silence. She said she didn't recognize the spending pattern. Said Robert had always been meticulous, even boring about money. They had budgeting apps, spreadsheets, plans for their kids' college. He wasn't reckless, at least not until now. Then came the phone. Buried in a carrier metadata report was an activation for a prepaid phone under a different name, Jason Teller. The address used matched the same Joliet P.O. box. The number had limited usage, mostly data-based, but one recurring contact number was traced to a woman named Kelsey Merton. She was 30, a freelance graphic designer, lived in Milwaukee. Investigators noted multiple voice calls and messages exchanged between the second phone and hers over the span of 6 months. Ellen had never heard the name before. A subpoena for Kelsey's phone records confirmed the contact. Surveillance photos showed Robert with her twice in public, once at a coffee shop in downtown Milwaukee and once entering a boutique hotel with her 3 months before his disappearance. Kelsey had no criminal record, no prior connection to his work, but she wasn't answering calls now. When police visited her listed address, the landlord reported she'd vacated suddenly 2 weeks prior without notice. The discovery triggered a shift in Ellen's demeanor. She stopped speaking to the media, withdrew from interviews. Friends said she still wore her wedding ring, but the photos in the house began to come down. She told investigators that she and Robert had been going through things, that for nearly a year something had changed. He was more distant, distracted, often irritable without cause. He started taking long walks alone, had begun sleeping in the downstairs office under the excuse of late-night coding. She suspected something, but she hadn't known the extent, or who. At work, Robert's colleagues began filling in gaps. One developer on his team, Dan, mentioned Robert had recently become fixated on surveillance, constantly worried about being watched, monitored, followed. He'd installed third-party firewalls on his work laptop. Had started keeping his office door closed during breaks. Once, Dan said, Robert asked him if he thought someone could clone a SIM card just by being close enough in a crowded place. At the time, it sounded like a joke. Looking back, it didn't feel like one. Another coworker recalled Robert becoming weirdly jumpy whenever phone calls came in from unknown numbers. There were times he'd step outside mid-meeting, pacing the parking lot in tight circles, muttering. When asked, he always blamed work stress, but his eyes had changed, like he was listening for something that wasn't there. Police couldn't ignore the behavioral spiral. The cash withdrawals, the burner phone, the secret relationship. It painted a picture of a man under pressure, a man who might have been preparing for something, escape perhaps, or confrontation. But what no one could determine was whether Robert was running from something or someone. Investigators went back to the airport footage again, this time with fresh eyes. That shadowed figure following Robert now took on new meaning. Was it a stalker, a blackmailer, someone he'd owed money to? Or had the paranoia simply bled into his own perceptions, making everyone look suspicious? There was no hard evidence pointing to violence. No life insurance cash out, no final confession. But what remained was the sense of slow unraveling, of a man compartmentalizing his life until there was no one left who truly knew him. As the month stretched into a year, the public's interest faded. The posters were taken down, the vigils stopped, but the marriage left behind had already fractured before the suitcase ever turned up. The Keller family wasn't just missing a husband and father, they were missing the man they thought he was. And somewhere, miles from the polished airport floors and structured life he left behind, that suitcase had waited, holding the last pieces of a story no one had finished telling. It was a desk clerk at the Havenwood Inn who connected the dots, months after the media had stopped running Robert Keller's name in headlines. A new detective on the case had begun rechecking hotel records near Milwaukee, prompted by that second phone number, the one linked to Kelsey Merton. A quiet search of lodging databases turned up something overlooked, a 2-night reservation under the name R. Keller at a boutique hotel just off East Mason Street. Check-in, October 19, 2016. The same day Robert supposedly vanished en route to San Francisco. The reservation was for room 418, paid in full with a card later matched to one of Robert's lesser-known accounts. The booking had been made 3 days prior from an IP address geolocated to his home office in Naperville. Security footage retrieved from the hotel showed a grainy but confirmable image. Robert Keller, just past 9 a.m. on the 19th, entering the lobby alongside a woman. She had auburn hair pulled into a low braid, dark jeans, a red flannel shirt. The clerk remembered them clearly, not because of anything dramatic, but because they'd declined housekeeping for both days, requesting extra privacy. That woman was later confirmed as Kelsey Merton, the freelance designer tied to the secondary phone. At first, investigators believed Robert had staged his disappearance to run off with Kelsey. The dates lined up. So did the deception. But then another thread unraveled the theory. Kelsey Merton was reported missing 3 days later by her sister. She'd failed to respond to texts, missed a weekend family dinner, and hadn't shown up to a scheduled client meeting. Her last known location was also the Havenwood Inn, confirmed by checkout records showing room 418 had been vacated on the morning of October 21st. But when police visited her apartment, there was no sign of her. Her mail had piled up, her cat had been left unfed, her laptop was gone, along with a duffel bag. Her phone had been powered off since the night of the 20th. 2 days later, her car was found. It had been abandoned near the edge of Kettle Moraine State Forest, just off a rarely used access road. The keys were still in the ignition. The driver's side window was half down, despite light rain having passed through the area. Inside, police found Kelsey's purse on the passenger seat, but no wallet, No phone, no visible blood or signs of struggle. No indication the vehicle had been broken into. Cadaver dogs were brought in, so were aerial units. The forest was wide, dense, and largely unmonitored. Over several days, search crews scoured the trails, combed creek beds, and mapped the terrain for disturbed soil. They found nothing. When Robert's name came up during interviews with Kelsey's family, reactions were mixed. Her sister knew of a man she'd been seeing for several months, but had never met him. Kelsey had been vague, said he was married, older, worked in tech. According to her, they had plans to end things cleanly. She said he was under pressure. That he talked about starting over somewhere, but wasn't ready to make a decision. The implication was chilling. Had Kelsey met Robert in Milwaukee for a final conversation? Or something else? Had they both walked into that hotel intending to disappear together, or had only one of them left alive? Robert, now missing for over a month, became a person of interest in Kelsey's case. Detectives in Wisconsin cross-referenced the Milwaukee hotel footage with highway toll cameras and traffic surveillance. They traced a vehicle resembling Kelsey's driving westbound on State Route 67 the morning after the hotel checkout. In the passenger seat, a male figure. Possibly Robert. The footage was unclear. Plate numbers couldn't be verified. The trail went cold just 2 miles outside Kettle Moraine's boundary. The FBI reclassified Robert's case from missing to missing under suspicious circumstances. It marked a subtle but critical shift, opening avenues for deeper surveillance records, interstate data sharing, and forensic warrants. They pulled Robert's digital footprint again. Still nothing. His known accounts were dormant. The burner phone had never reconnected. His social security number hadn't triggered. If he was alive, he wasn't leaving fingerprints. If he was dead, he wasn't found. Ellen Keller, still reeling from the revelations about her husband's affair, gave one final interview before retreating from public view. She said she no longer believed he'd been taken, that whatever had happened between Robert and Kelsey hadn't started at the airport. It had started months before. He was already gone, she said. He just hadn't told us yet. What no one could explain was Kelsey's role in all of it. If she had been complicit in Robert's disappearance, why vanish herself? If she had planned to run with him, why leave her car in the open? Why bring a purse and not her phone? If Robert had harmed her, where was the evidence? The Milwaukee hotel became a place of quiet interest for years. Room 418 was never used again under the same number. A new door plaque reads, 420 now. The front desk staff still remember the couple that came in without suitcases and paid in full for 2 nights they didn't stay to enjoy. And somewhere beyond that room, along the forest that swallowed their final known trail, a darker truth waited, buried, abandoned, or left behind in silence. A truth no one would touch again until the suitcase appeared. And one of them finally told the story neither could finish. It was early November 2016 when the first break in months came from an unlikely place, a gas station off Highway 63 in northern Wisconsin. The clerk, a woman named Teresa, wasn't sure why she remembered the man, except that something about him felt off. He'd come in just after dawn, clothes dirty, limping slightly, paid cash for a gallon of water, a granola bar, and a small map of state trails. He didn't say much, didn't smile. His hands were shaking as he counted the bills. Teresa said it was the eyes that stuck with her, blank, like he'd walked through something and hadn't come back all the way. She recognized him days later, watching an old segment about Robert Keller's disappearance on a local station. She wasn't certain, but close enough to make the call. That same afternoon, just 15 miles from the gas station, a bow hunter named Greg Hanley was setting up for the late-season rut along a ridge deep in the Chequamegon-Nicolet National Forest. Around noon, he reported hearing something unnatural, one sharp, high-pitched scream followed by complete silence. Not animal, not echo. It unnerved him enough to abandon his post in Radio Forest Service. The overlapping timing drew immediate attention from local law enforcement. The forest spanned nearly 1.5 million acres, most of it remote. Terrain varied from bogs to dense pine thickets to rocky glacial outcrops. It was easy to vanish out there. Search teams were deployed within 36 hours. Drones were launched, dogs brought in, helicopters used to survey clearings. For 3 days, they found nothing but boot tracks in soft mud, some fresh, some possibly days old. Then, just as they were preparing to scale back, a team found it. Roughly 5 miles off the main fire road, near the bank of a dry stream bed, searchers stumbled onto what looked like a makeshift campsite. There was a flattened patch of ground, a blackened fire ring, and the remnants of what had once been a tarp tent. Nearby, they found fragments of scorched clothing, some melted into the dirt, a blood-stained shirt sleeve, what appeared to be the side panel of a burned backpack, charred scraps of a spiral-bound notebook, unreadable, but no body, no bones, no personal ID. Forensics moved in fast. Samples were collected from the blood-stained fabric. Soil was lifted, packaged, tested. Results came back several days later. The blood was human, male, a match for Robert Keller. The site appeared recently abandoned. Investigators noted signs of someone trying to destroy evidence, fire accelerants detected, ash patterns consistent with deliberate ignition. But it had rained the night before the discovery, likely dousing any remaining flames. The area wasn't visible from above. No fresh tire tracks or paths leading in. It was enough to reclassify Robert's case again. No longer just a missing person, now officially treated as a suspected victim of violent circumstances or possibly self-harm. Either way, the narrative shifted. Robert had made it out of the airport, he had crossed state lines, and at some point he had ended up bleeding, burning things in the woods, and then disappearing again. The detail that caught investigators most off guard was how little he seemed to have brought with him. No tent poles, no gear, no food packaging. It wasn't a prepared wilderness escape, it was survival improvisation, desperation, not planning. And whoever had been with him, if anyone, was gone too. Search efforts around the site ramped up. Cadaver dogs were run along the stream beds. Teams scoured nearby caves and depressions, checking for signs of shelter or burial. But nothing else turned up. No second blood trail. No indicators of struggle beyond the initial stain. No prints except partial boot treads, size 10. Robert's size. Investigators debated the timeline. Could Robert have walked nearly 300 miles from Chicago to that part of Wisconsin? It seemed implausible. But there were gaps. Nearly 3 weeks unaccounted for between his disappearance at O'Hare and this sighting. Plenty of time for hidden transportation, hitchhiking, or help from someone else. Maybe Kelsey. Maybe not. When her car was discovered abandoned in Kettle Moraine just 2 weeks earlier, it had seemed like a tragic fork in the road. But now the distance between her car and the burned campsite raised more questions. Had they traveled together part of the way? Had they split up intentionally or violently? Had she died in those woods too? Local officers reopened missing persons reports tied to that region. None matched. No female remains were found nearby. No witness came forward to say they'd seen a woman with Robert. If Kelsey had been there, she'd left no trace. And if she hadn't, why was Robert up there at all? The idea began forming quietly in the margins of reports and off-the-record conversations. Maybe Robert wasn't running from law enforcement. Maybe he was running from something else entirely. Guilt, panic, or someone who had been with them, unseen in the hotel, untracked by cameras. The forest, for all its silence, held a story. Pieces of it were still buried under moss and pine needles, washed out by rain, scattered by wind. But for the first time since he vanished, Robert Keller's path had reappeared. And wherever he was heading when he left that campsite, he hadn't meant to come back. The suitcase wouldn't be found for years. But the forest was where the spiral turned violent, where the secrets started to surface in ash and blood, where whatever happened between Robert and Kelsey had begun to rot in the open, waiting to be uncovered. In January 2019, a call came into the Duluth Police Department about a break-in at a condemned shipping warehouse near the edge of the industrial district. The place had been slated for demolition for over a year, its metal frame half-eaten by rust, insulation hanging like torn cloth from the rafters. A crew sent to assess the building had found signs of occupation: blankets, empty cans, makeshift bedding, human presence where there wasn't supposed to be any. When officers arrived, they found a man named James Larrabee, 52, known drifter, no fixed address. He'd broken into the warehouse for warmth, no resistance, no violence. Just an old man with frostbitten fingers and a nervous glance. Standard trespassing. They almost let it end there. But during intake, James said something strange. Mentioned a man he'd shared heat with 2 winters ago. A quiet guy, thin. Moved like he'd once been somebody else. Called himself Rick. He didn't talk much, James told them. But when he did, it was like he was still somewhere else. Spoke like a guy who'd lost everything. Like a ghost trying to remember who he was. He remembered the man had a limp, burn marks down one hand, kept to himself mostly, but once showed James how to start a fire with a tin can and a piece of foil. Said he'd been an engineer once. Out west, he'd added, before things fell apart. It would have passed as nothing more than a story, one of 100 like it, until James led them to the back corner of the warehouse to a crumpled pile of debris, where old food tins and blackened cook surfaces remained. One tin, dusty, rusted on the rim, was collected by a young officer more out of protocol than expectation. A week later, that tin came back from the lab. On its outer ridge was a partial thumbprint. It matched one already in the federal database. It belonged to Robert Keller. The find stunned local law enforcement. For over 2 years, Keller had been presumed dead. His trail vanished somewhere in the Chequamegon-Nicolet forest. Now, that assumption collapsed. He had survived, at least long enough to make it nearly 150 miles northwest, across state lines into Minnesota. And he hadn't just passed through. He had stopped, stayed, made fires, shared shelter. Investigators returned to the warehouse with cadaver dogs, sonar, and heat sensors. No remains were found. But within a cracked HVAC duct, they pulled a melted strip of plastic, likely part of a phone case, and a zipper tab from a backpack brand sold exclusively online. Ellen Keller confirmed Robert had owned both items. More curious were the markings on the wall. Etched into the drywall with what looked like a nail were a series of numbers, names, and fragments of phrases. Most were indecipherable, but one stood out, written in jagged, overlapping scratches. Not her, not her fault. Psychologists later speculated Robert may have been suffering from prolonged trauma, possibly even a psychotic break. The injuries, the isolation, the guilt. Whatever had happened in that forest, it hadn't just taken someone else's life, it had fractured his. But still, the question lingered. Why hadn't he come home? Why, after escaping the forest, after surviving the cold, after making it all the way to Duluth, hadn't he reached out? To his wife, his kids, his parents, anyone. Ellen didn't have an answer. When informed of the discovery, she cried, but not with relief, with something closer to dread. She said she no longer understood the man they were looking for, that Robert Keller had become someone else long before he disappeared. If he was alive all that time, she said quietly, then he made a choice. That choice, whether driven by shame, fear, or some deeper deterioration, became the new focus of the case. A man doesn't survive 3 years in silence without reason. He doesn't change his name, hide in abandoned buildings, leave no messages unless he believes he can't go back, or unless someone else is still out there, someone he was running from. The Duluth lead reopened everything: the forest, the campsite, the missing woman. If Robert had made it out, had Kelsey? Had someone else been involved? Had she died and he carried that truth like a stone in his chest? Or had something even worse taken place, something Robert couldn't speak aloud? Not to a stranger, not to law enforcement, not even to himself. In a report filed quietly, the lead investigator wrote a single sentence in the margin. The question is no longer where he went. It's why he stayed gone. The warehouse was eventually torn down, but that corner, where the makeshift fires had burned and a man called Rick tried to vanish into ash, left behind a timeline. One that stretched longer than anyone had guessed, one that said Robert Keller had been living with what happened. Until, one day, he wasn't. Because sometime after that winter, he vanished again. And this time, he left something behind that would finally tell the rest of the story. A suitcase, abandoned, preserved, and still holding the truth. In the fall of 2023, 7 years after Robert Keller vanished, a state-funded restoration project began at the edge of the Chequamegon-Nicolet National Forest. The goal was simple: renovate a dilapidated ranger outpost deep in a restricted section of the woods, unused since the early 2000s. Over the years, the building had become a ghost structure. Its roof partially collapsed, its wiring corroded, its existence forgotten by most, except for those with access to the old trail maps. On the second day of demolition, a contractor working on the subfloor reported an odd obstruction behind a warped wall panel near the back of the utility room. At first, they assumed it was old HVAC ducting or discarded metal shelving. But when they pried the rotted drywall loose, what emerged was something far stranger: a freezer. Commercial grade. Sealed shut with strips of duct tape that had long since dried and cracked. Its sides had rusted into the surrounding foundation, giving the illusion it had grown out of the concrete itself. No one could explain how it had ended up there. It wasn't listed in the original equipment inventory from decades ago. The outpost had no refrigeration needs by the time it was shuttered, and it had no connection to any documented ranger activity. The team called it in. State police took custody of the freezer. It was carefully transported to a forensic lab where technicians broke the seal under controlled conditions. Inside, they found a layer of mildewed thermal blankets, likely used as insulation. Beneath that was a large, dark gray suitcase, battered, water-damaged, but structurally intact. Its zipper was corroded, but one flap bore the faded imprint of a Samsonite logo. The tag on the handle was still legible. A laminated sticker peeling at the corners. It read, R. Keller, ORD to SFO, OCT 19, 2016. The suitcase Robert Keller had been seen wheeling into O'Hare Airport the day he vanished had finally been found. Not in San Francisco, not in a hotel, not in a storage locker or pawn shop or landfill, but in a freezer. In a ranger outpost, miles from the nearest trail. A place that hadn't seen human occupation in almost 20 years. Inside the suitcase were 3 items. The first was a water-damaged burner phone, powered off, its charging port corroded. The second was a leather-bound journal, the kind sold in stationery shops. Its pages were swollen, edges browned, but many entries remained legible. The third was a disposable camera, unprocessed, wrapped in a sandwich bag as makeshift waterproofing. The journal was the first priority. Investigators, archivists, and psychologists read it cover to cover, piecing together its entries like fragments of a confession. Most were undated, some barely legible. The early pages described disorientation, hunger, and isolation, Robert wandering the forest after leaving the burnt campsite discovered in 2016. He wrote of cold nights, of hiding, of dreams that bled into waking. He made reference to the fire and what happened by the creek, but never elaborated clearly. Names were omitted, locations coded in shorthand. As the pages went on, a new voice emerged, a man no longer just lost, but haunted. He described being followed, not by rangers or search teams, but by a single person, sometimes a woman, sometimes a man with a limp. He wrote of hearing whispers outside tree lines, of finding boot prints beside his own. One entry simply read, "She knows. I saw it in her eyes before she turned away." The final written page, almost blank, held just one sentence, scrawled with a shaking hand and smeared with moisture. "She knew, but she forgave me." The disposable camera, once developed, added another layer. 17 images total. Most were grainy shots of the forest, branches at odd angles, a crude shelter, the rim of a campfire. One image showed the interior of what appeared to be the outpost, confirming Robert had been inside. Another showed a mirror propped against a wall with a distorted reflection of a man, thin and unshaven, holding the camera. The timestamp had been corrupted, but image experts placed it no earlier than late 2018. 2 final photos stood out. One was of a woman sitting on a boulder by a river bend, turned slightly away from the lens. Her face was blurred, but her posture, tense, shoulders hunched, suggested she'd been unaware of the photo being taken. The last image was darker. A dim corner of a room, possibly the outpost again. The only source of light came from a sliver through a boarded window. In the middle of the frame sat the suitcase itself, open, empty, next to what appeared to be a sealed freezer door. This time, Robert hadn't vanished without trace. He'd documented something, hidden it, preserved it, and walked away, again. Why he sealed the suitcase inside a freezer, why he chose that location, and whether he ever returned again after that final photo, none of it could be confirmed. No fingerprints were found beyond his, no signs of recent life inside the outpost. But the suitcase shifted everything. For the first time, there was a tangible connection between his disappearance and his state of mind. Not just survival, not just fear, but intention. The line, "She knew, but she forgave me," echoed like a whisper through the entire case file. It was unclear whether he meant Kelsey, or Ellen, or someone else, but it was the closest thing to a confession anyone had ever found. Whatever had happened in those woods wasn't just about getting lost, it was about what he couldn't bring back with him. And what he chose to leave behind. The photos from the disposable camera were developed carefully, first scanned in digital layers, then handled in a climate-controlled forensic lab to preserve any remaining prints or chemical traces. Most of the 17 images confirmed what investigators expected: forests, improvised shelters, crude fire pits, the interiors of run-down cabins, fragments of Robert's time off-grid, moments suspended in the silence between survival and surrender. But buried in those quiet scenes were 3 photographs that changed the direction of the case entirely. The first appeared roughly halfway through the sequence. It was taken indoors, likely using flash, judging by the harsh reflection against the wall behind him. The photo was of Robert, mirror selfie. His face was gaunt, pale, thinner than the last confirmed sighting in the Milwaukee hotel. But it was his expression that stood out, eyes wide, brow creased, mouth slightly open like he'd been caught mid-thought. Along the left side of his face, stretching from temple to jawline, was a raw, swollen gash, partially healed but still angry-looking, the kind of wound that comes from falling hard onto something sharp, or being struck. Forensic analysts couldn't determine exactly when the photo had been taken, but by comparing facial bruising to the few dated images of Robert from earlier sightings, they placed it no earlier than late 2017. Well over a year after his disappearance, which meant Robert hadn't just survived, he'd continued living in isolation, navigating the wilderness, enduring injuries he never reported. The second photo was worse. It was blurred, possibly taken in haste or with trembling hands. But it showed a person, seated, arms crossed tight, head slightly ducked, as if trying to disappear into herself. The lighting was poor, likely from a fire or lantern, and the background was dense with shadow. But the figure was unmistakably female. Long auburn hair pulled into a braid, faint plaid visible under a jacket, a facial outline that, when cross-referenced, bore strong similarity to Kelsey Merton, the woman who had vanished 3 days after being seen with Robert. Her eyes, though half obscured, appeared wide, tense, locked onto something just out of frame. There was no smile, no peace in her posture. She looked afraid, cornered, cold. The timestamp was damaged, unrecoverable. But the setting wasn't one of escape. It looked like confinement, not ropes or chains, nothing so obvious, but something in the way she held herself. As if she didn't think she'd leave that space. The photo raised impossible questions. Had Kelsey survived longer than anyone thought? Had she remained with Robert, willingly or otherwise? If she'd been alive after her last known sighting in Milwaukee, why hadn't she contacted anyone? And if she hadn't, what had happened between them? The third photo arrived last in sequence, a simple image, low angle, outdoors. At the center of the frame was a mound of freshly turned earth, partially covered in pine needles. Marking its head was a cross fashioned from 2 branches, tied with twine or old rope. The ground around it was still damp, edges darkened. To the left, a fallen log. To the right, a crude stone stack, possibly decorative, possibly to keep animals away. No feet, no shadows, no personal effects, just a grave. No GPS metadata existed. The disposable camera had no such feature. But by studying tree types, moss growth, and terrain patterns, forestry experts placed the burial somewhere in the northern half of the Chequamegon-Nicolet National Forest. They narrowed the terrain to roughly a 10-square-mile patch of mixed pine and wetland near the boundary of a no-camping zone. Still, the exact spot couldn't be found. Cadaver dogs were dispatched again. Trails were cut. Aerial drones mapped the canopy. But time had done its work. Rain had washed away scent, animals had shifted the terrain, and without the specific location, the grave from the photo remained only an image, never a recovery. Theories began to crystallize: the gash on Robert's face, the frightened posture of the woman resembling Kelsey, the lonely burial under the trees. One possibility began to stand out: something had gone wrong in the forest. A fight, an accident, or something worse. And Robert, unable to live with the weight of it, had buried what remained and vanished deeper into the woods. But another theory haunted investigators more: that the photo of Kelsey hadn't been one of accidental capture, but documentation. That Robert took the picture deliberately, not as a memory, but as a record, and that the grave marked more than guilt. It marked intent. Still, there was no way to know for sure. The journal gave no direct explanation, no name tied to the burial, no confession, just scattered phrases, regret etched into soaked paper, and that final line: "She knew, but she forgave me." Some read that as remorse, others saw it as rationalization. Ellen Keller was shown the photos in a private briefing. She looked at them quietly, then asked to see the grave again. When she did, she said nothing for a long time. "He didn't dig that for himself," she finally whispered. "Whoever's there, it wasn't him." The suitcase, the journal, and the photos were now evidence. But in the absence of bodies, they remained fragments, shards of a man unraveling across years and wilderness, hiding things, recording them, and then sealing it all away. If Robert Keller had tried to vanish after what happened in those woods, this was the first time his silence had cracked, not with words, not with bodies, but with the images left behind. In early 2024, nearly 8 years after Robert Keller disappeared, and just months after the suitcase was recovered, the investigation re-centered on the photo, the grave beneath the trees. It had become the obsession of cold case analysts and forensic botanists alike. Teams pored over every visual detail: the angle of light, the tree species, the presence of moss, the shape of the terrain. Weather logs were compared against visible dampness in the image. Soil color and lichen patterns were matched to terrain databases. Eventually, they narrowed it down. A region roughly 6 miles south of the 2016 burn site, still inside the Chequamegon-Nicolet National Forest, but well off public access trails. A forgotten route marked only by a broken wooden post and a rusted trailhead map, its ink faded into unreadable stains. The trail hadn't been officially maintained since 1994. It wasn't on any modern maps, but it was enough to launch a focused grid search. On April 16th, beneath a patch of canopy just beyond a mossy ridge, a searcher spotted something out of place. A sliver of wood in a cross formation, 2 sticks tied with fibrous rope, half covered in pine needles. Exactly like the one in the photo. The soil nearby had settled unnaturally, forming a shallow depression barely visible without the photo for comparison. Cadaver dogs confirmed what the photo had implied. They began digging. Roughly 20 inches beneath the surface, they uncovered 2 sets of remains, laid side by side, both in partial decomposition. Clothing fragments matched descriptions from both missing persons reports. One body was male, roughly 5'11", with burn scarring on one hand and a healed fracture in the left femur. The other, female, was smaller, skeletal remains bearing faint trace evidence of flannel fabric. Dental records and DNA testing confirmed what many had begun to suspect. The bodies were Robert Keller and Kelsey Merton. Robert's cause of death was consistent with prolonged exposure: hypothermia, dehydration, and possibly sepsis from an untreated wound on his leg. Kelsey's, however, told a different story. The forensic pathologist documented a depressed fracture to the skull, most likely caused by blunt force trauma. The blow had been deliberate, not accidental. It would have killed her within minutes. This was no survival tragedy. This was violence. The discovery rattled the investigative team. For years, Robert had been presumed the victim, or at least a man crushed by guilt. But the remains now suggested a darker possibility, that whatever happened between them had ended in death by force, that someone struck Kelsey down, then dug her grave, and then, instead of fleeing, laid down beside her, but not before documenting it. Buried in the pine needles just a few feet from the bodies, they found something else, a small metal flashlight, its casing rusted but intact. When wiped clean, a faint engraving on its base came into view. J.L. The initials didn't match Robert or Kelsey, and no one in either family had connections to anyone by those letters. It wasn't a mass-produced flashlight either, custom-made, sold in limited batches from a regional sporting goods store in Eau Claire, Wisconsin. Records from 2015 showed one such flashlight purchased by a former Park Service employee named Jeremy Lang. Lang had worked as a seasonal ranger's assistant between 2002 and 2010. After that, no fixed employment. He'd been flagged briefly in 2017 during an unrelated property dispute involving an abandoned cabin in northern Wisconsin, but no charges were filed. He lived off-grid for stretches of time, mostly moving between trailers, odd jobs, and remote shelters. His name had never surfaced in the Keller investigation. Until now. A warrant was issued for Lang's last known trailer, located near the boundary of the National Forest. What they found there was minimal: paper maps, survival tools, water-purifying tablets. But in a locked trunk beneath the trailer's floorboards, they discovered items that made the investigation turn. Inside was a torn notebook page. On it, smeared handwriting. She was screaming again, told him to stop. I didn't want to do it. But he said we couldn't let her go. Investigators now believed a third person had been present in the forest. The theory emerging was grim. Robert and Kelsey hadn't been alone in the woods. Whether Jeremy Lang had encountered them accidentally or had been brought in earlier, no one could say for sure. But something had happened, some confrontation, some escalation, that ended with Kelsey dead and Robert injured. The question no one could answer was whether Robert had struck the blow or stood by while someone else did. The journal found in the suitcase offered no names, just guilt, fear, and the final line. She knew, but she forgave me. Some believed that meant Robert had killed her. Others believed it meant he hadn't stopped it. Either way, his body was now beside hers, in a grave he likely dug himself, and the man who might have watched it happen, Jeremy Lang, was still alive. What began as a man's quiet disappearance had now become a double death in the woods, one accidental, one not, and a flashlight left behind suggested someone else had survived that moment, someone who had stayed quiet. Until now. By the summer of 2024, the case of Robert Keller's disappearance no longer lived in rumor or mystery. For nearly 8 years, his name had been linked to shadowy theories, grainy footage, and quiet grief. But now, with 2 bodies recovered, a journal unearthed, a camera developed, and a suspect named, investigators could finally piece together what had actually happened and why Robert never came home. It began, as many things do, with a fracture long before the fall. Robert's affair with Kelsey Merton had begun in late 2015 during a freelance app design contract between her and his company. At first, it was digital, casual, even mundane. Emails disguised as work threads, midday calls. By spring of 2016, it had turned physical. She lived in Milwaukee. He found reasons to travel for meetings. The second phone followed soon after. Kelsey wasn't unaware of his life. She knew he had a wife, children, a suburban home filled with reminders of who he was supposed to be. But as the months passed, she began pushing for more. Not stolen hours in hotel rooms, not encrypted messages. She wanted something real. Robert had promised he'd tell Ellen, said it was just a matter of timing. But by October, the lie had reached its edge. According to Kelsey's sister, Kelsey had given him an ultimatum the week before the trip. Leave your wife, or I will tell her myself. Robert's response was a quiet deviation from his routine. He told his family he was heading to San Francisco, packed his suitcase, and drove to O'Hare, where cameras captured his final steps. But instead of boarding his flight, he left the terminal, exited a service corridor, and caught a rideshare north. By that afternoon, he was in Milwaukee. By nightfall, he and Kelsey had checked into room 418 at the Havenwood Inn. What he told her in that room is unknown. But the next morning, they were seen leaving together with camping gear, food, and a paper map of the Chequamegon-Nicolet National Forest. Kelsey had texted a friend, saying she was finally getting off the grid. It was the last message she ever sent. Forensic analysis and journal entries suggest Robert pitched the trip as a weekend escape, a reset. No distractions, no pressure, just the two of them, alone in the woods to figure things out. But at some point, the tone shifted. The journal, found in the suitcase buried in the Ranger outpost freezer, begins with vague optimism, then descends quickly into fear. The entries describe arguments by the creek, Kelsey threatening to leave, Robert pleading with her to wait. Mentions of the screaming begin halfway through. One line reads, "I didn't want it to go this far, but she wouldn't stop." Whether he struck her in rage or panic, no one can say for certain. But Kelsey Merton died that weekend from blunt force trauma to the skull. Her body, buried beneath a shallow mound and marked with a wooden cross, was found beside Robert's, both side by side years later. But they hadn't been entirely alone. DNA found on a discarded flashlight at the burial site belonged to Jeremy Lang, a former seasonal ranger's assistant with a history of squatting in abandoned forest structures. His initials, JL, were etched into the flashlight base. A search of his trailer uncovered maps, equipment, and a single notebook page referencing a woman who screamed again. Lang was arrested in June 2024. During questioning, Lang claimed he hadn't killed anyone, said he'd been squatting in an old fire tower when he saw smoke near the old creek bed. By the time he arrived, the woman was already dead. Robert was still there, injured, crying, rambling about how no one would believe it wasn't on purpose. Lang said he helped move the body, watched Robert dig, took some of their supplies afterward, then left. He said Robert never threatened him, never begged for help. Just sat beside the grave like he planned to stay there forever. No physical evidence tied Lang to the act of killing. But his silence, his decision to leave the scene without reporting it, left an ethical stain that couldn't be scrubbed away. Ultimately, no charges for homicide were filed against Lang. He was prosecuted for obstruction and illegal possession of state property. He served time, but not for murder. The final moments of Robert Keller's life were likely spent in physical pain and mental collapse. The gash on his face, the infection in his leg, the hallucinations detailed in his journal. He wasn't just hiding. He was deteriorating. The last photo on the disposable camera, showing the suitcase and the freezer door, suggests he returned to the outpost to hide what remained, not just evidence, but the story. Ellen Keller was notified first. She declined to speak publicly, except for one sentence offered in a private statement. "I think he wanted to be found, just not right away." Robert's body was cremated. Kelsey's family held a service in Madison and buried her beside her mother. The grave in the forest was covered over with clean soil. A plaque was later installed at the old Ranger outpost, not as a memorial, but as a marker. A place where a man, undone by shame, fear, and guilt, tried to seal a truth he could no longer carry. The suitcase is now stored in evidence, a quiet container of everything Robert tried to hide and everything that eventually revealed him.